Before our famous flight in 2009, I'd been flying airplanes for 42 years, and I had never been so challenged in an airplane I doubted the outcome. I'm Captain Sully Sullenberger, probably best known as the captain of U.S. Airways Flight 1549 just over 10 years ago. I grew up in a small town in North Texas, Denison, Texas. My mother was a first grade teacher for 25 years. My dad was a dentist. I was shy, quiet, introverted, but very, very curious. By the time I was 5, the die was cast. I'd seen enough airplanes flying over our house in North Texas that I knew I wanted to spend my life flying airplanes. In looking back on it, there really have been two things that have always fascinated me about flight: the mastery it requires and the freedom that it affords. When one goes only a few thousand feet above the Earth's surface, one widens one's perspective, has a very different view of the world, and all the pedestrian concerns that we have seem to pale by comparison. And the first time I actually had a chance to fly an airplane, to take the controls myself at age 16, it was the realization of a lifelong dream. There are real risks in flying, in spite of how ultra-safe it's ultimately become. And one of the great challenges now in aviation, when it's become so safe, is to remain vigilant and not become complacent, because one never knows on any given day when or even if they might someday face an ultimate challenge. We also have to have such a deep understanding of our machines, of our profession, of our roles and responsibilities as team members, that we can face challenges we've never seen before, never anticipated, never trained for, and still have a paradigm of how to handle it and set clear priorities. And that's what we did 10 years ago on the famous flight to the Hudson. January 15, 2009 started just like 10,000 other days, literally. Flight 1549 was completely routine and unremarkable for the first 100 seconds. But this very suddenly, and I was aware of it at the time, became the worst day of my life. I saw the birds about 3 seconds before we struck them, and then they filled the windscreen as if it were a Hitchcock film. And they struck the airplane along the leading edges of the wings, the nose, and into the center, the core of both jet engines. I could hear terrible noises from the machinery being damaged I'd never heard in an airplane before. I could feel terrible vibrations I'd never felt in an airplane before. And then the thrust loss was sudden, complete, symmetrical bilaterally, both engines at once. And I could feel my pulse shoot up, my blood pressure spike, my perceptual field narrow in tunnel vision because of the stress. Followed immediately by a realization that unlike all those other flights I'd had for 42 years, this one probably would not end on a runway with the aircraft undamaged. I turned on the engine ignition, so if the engines could recover, they would, and I started the airplane's auxiliary power unit. I took control of the aircraft, and I told the controller we were going to be in the Hudson. He told me later he was shocked, and he assumed that by choosing that path, that we would all perish. Our first officer, Jeff Skiles, couldn't have had a better colleague that day or since. He and I were able to collaborate wordlessly by knowing intuitively in this developing crisis what we should do to help the other based on our own long experience. I had a chance to make only one announcement in the cabin. I wanted to sound confident, not agitated, because I knew that courage can be contagious. And I chose specific words for specific reasons. I said, "This is the captain, brace for impact." It comforted me to know that by saying the few words I had, but choosing the right words, I had literally gotten my crew on the same page. And that if I could find a way to deliver this aircraft to the surface intact, it would float long enough for the flight attendants to evacuate the passengers and for New York Waterway to send their ferries to pick us out of the water. And then finally, as we were approaching the water, Jeff began to call out to me airspeed and altitude as I was looking at the water ahead to help me judge that critical height. And we were coming down so rapidly, if I misjudged it even by a fraction, we might start too soon and get too slow and hit hard, or start too late and descend into the water too rapidly in the wrong attitude. As we hit hard, but the deceleration, while rapid, was uniform. But we weren't high-fiving. We still had to get 155 people out of an airplane taking on water in a river in January. I opened the cockpit door and shouted one word: evacuate. And by the time I left the airplane, I was the last one off. But it was an agonizing 4 hours until I finally received word officially that everyone was accounted for. And only then were my immediate duties completed. I didn't do this alone. I could not have done it alone. And I had never met some of the crew before. I had never met Jeff Skiles, our first officer, before we began this trip. Right after the flight, in the first interviews, I said that we were all just doing our jobs. But we did much more than that. And with the passage of time, I have a much more complete appreciation of what was accomplished that day by everyone. And we did our jobs, but we did them exceedingly well. It's having that dedication, that continuous learning, constant striving for excellence, that determination on every flight, on every day, that formed the foundation on which we could then rise to the occasion on this extreme crisis.